So I'm going to start with the take-home message, get right to it. Right? This is, if you're going to forget everything else today, remember this. All behavior serves a function. And if you can appreciate that and identify what function it's serving, you're halfway to solving it, as opposed to just being frustrated, thinking it's there just to upset you. Right? Some teachers are like, he's just doing it to bother me, just doing it to be bad. No, that's not a function of behavior, just being bad. So you need to understand function. The bolting question that we started with. What do I do when there's a bolter? When someone has a serious problem that they bring to me, that's usually the question that they ask is, what do I do when he does problem? And they're looking for strategies. It's a mistake. It's technically a mistake to just say, well, you should start doing this, and to offer suggestions and strategies. Your first question when someone brings a problem to you is not what should you do about it, it should be, why is he doing it? What's he getting out of it? Because we tend not to do things unless they serve a purpose for us. If we do things over and over again, they're working for us in some way. This has to be working for the student in some way. So that needs to be our first question. And it's really a paradigm shift from just, well, here's some ideas, to pause, resist that urge, don't go there yet. Why is he doing it? If I can appreciate and understand that, then what I come up with for strategies will be what we consider to be functionally related strategies, not just shots in the dark. The problem with shots in the dark is every now and then you get lucky, and that reinforces you for continuing to take shots in the dark. But more often than not, you miss the target, and then you've wasted time and resources on not solving a problem, just trying strategies, in which case all you're pulling from is a bag of tricks without any analysis, right? It's just a bag of tricks. That's not applied behavior analysis, which is analytic. So understanding before acting increases your chance of being effective. So it gives new meaning to this. Not what you think. What's the function? Someone brings you a problem, you should be going, WTF. No, not that. I'm wondering what the function. B.F. Skinner wonders, what's the function? In addition to developing a line of geeky behavioral bumper stickers like, in God we trust and all others must collect data, I'm going to come up with an apparel line. What's the function t-shirts? WTF on the front, what's the function on the back? Right? So this is a big idea. Your first question when there's a problem, what's the function? How is this working for my student? So I'm going to keep coming back to that, what's the function? But let's start talking about the problems with problem behavior to kind of set the stage here. There's a lot of problems with problem behavior, which it's kind of self-evident, right? It's a barrier to quality of life and dignity. How is it a barrier to quality of life? Well, if you engage in a lot of problem behavior, high rates of problem behavior is associated with lots of negative emotion, right? If you're constantly engaging in problem behavior, if your student's constantly engaging in problem behavior, arguably that's not a very happy person, right? I'm not happy if I'm engaging in problem behavior. That's about my quality of life. And the longer that goes on, the more it permeates areas of my life, the bigger a problem it is. It can also be a threat to dignity, because I see lots of kids when they get really upset, do undignified things, like take off their clothes in public, act in ways that afterwards they might feel a little bit embarrassed or ashamed of, that really stigmatize them in front of their peers. Right? And so it's not very dignified when someone is allowed to engage in these massive demonstrative behaviors. Right? I had a kid a couple of years ago pick up a desk and toss it through the window of his classroom in grade 2. That was a threat to his dignity because he was viewed, now he had a reputation for the rest of his school career and all of his peers, and the word gets out, and that affects his ability to live with dignity. A barrier to learning. If you've got a student engaging in a lot of problem behaviors, that means they're not available for learning. You don't have opportunities to do learn units. If you're managing problem behaviors all day long, guess what you're not doing? You're not working on social skills, you're not working on communication, you're not teaching literacy, you're not teaching math, you're not spending time in the classroom, you're not practicing group behavior skills, right? Pro-social behaviors, because all you're doing is managing problem behavior. And part of the punchline of that, or the implication is, this makes it a priority to address and remediate the problem behavior, arguably over all else, because we need to remove this barrier so that we can move forward to dedicate our time to teaching, right? Yesterday we talked about excesses and deficits. We want to bring down this severe excess so that we can focus on all those important deficits like language, communication, play, and social. It's stigmatizing and a barrier to social interactions, right? The word gets out that this is a bad kid, this is a scary kid. If Johnny has a lot of problem behaviors in class, what do the kids go home and tell their parents? And then when Johnny's mom says, can we set up a play date? she's going to have a hard time finding a play date because the parents have heard from their kids about Johnny's behavior and parents just don't want to go there, right? It can be a barrier. Barrier to social interactions in school, when it's time to have partners or work in groups. If there's a kid who's been scary with their problem behavior, especially in the younger grades, right? Severe problem behavior in kindergarten, grade 1 in particular, is particularly traumatic to little kids because kindergarten is supposed to be Disneyland, right? Kindergarten is the happiest place on earth. My favorite classrooms to go into are kindergarten classrooms. And if there's serious problem behavior, that really throws a monkey wrench into what kindergarten should be. It's a barrier to community involvement for both home and school. So some of my clients who've got very serious problem behaviors, guess what happens at home? They don't go out. They haven't been on vacation. They can't go to a restaurant. They don't go to family gatherings. They're extremely isolated, and this just becomes a cycle, a self-sustaining cycle. It gets worse over time. It doesn't get better. And what's the future in this? And then at school, I've been giving this a lot of thought over the last couple of years, the number of kids I work with who don't go on field trips with their class on a regular basis. And there's just kind of this default assumption that, well, the class is going to Science World, but of course Freddie's not going, right? What if he does this? And so it's just taken for granted, like just assumed, of course Freddie's not going. And I go in with the counter-assumption, well, why can't Freddie go? Because he might hit somebody or run away. He might, but if we just keep him here doing nothing, then how will this ever get better, right? The absence of a plan, there's no plan. So this becomes increasingly debilitating, and it's a cumulative effect, right? Every time I don't get to go on a school trip, I don't get to go on a field trip, I don't get to go to the grocery store, I don't get to go swimming, I don't get to go Science World, I have lost learn units. Because all the other kids, this is part of their cumulative learning experience. They're encountering thousands and thousands upon thousands of learn units. Opportunities to engage with the world and experience the consequences. And we're depriving our students of these, not we necessarily, but the presence of problem behavior can contribute to depriving them of these. Right? So there's another argument for why this really deserves our attention. And then it's a barrier to vocational settings and quality of life as an adult. How are we going to get somebody a job at Walmart or in an office or anywhere else if they have problem behavior? Right? It's difficult enough with all the handicap-isms that act as barriers to integrating our young people and adults with autism into the workforce and into society. Right? People can often be kind of concerned and skeptical that this is going to work. So there's zero tolerance there for problem behavior. Right? If you're working part-time in Canadian Tire and you fall down and you're screaming in Canadian Tire, that's scaring away our customers. Right? Those contingencies aren't going to allow that to continue. So addressing problem behavior really does deserve our full-time attention because of the cumulative effect in the future, right? So again, I'm preaching to the choir here. You guys are nodding, you get this. We're just kind of making it more explicit. And perhaps sometimes when you need, in your school settings, if you need to be attending to problem behavior and you're running up into barriers, you can use these types of arguments for why it's so important that we address these things. I work with one school district on a monthly basis. I go in as a consultant to their autism team in the school district. And many of the cases they bring for discussion are about kids who the staff refuse to let them leave the school. They can't go anywhere. They're not learning to use the bus. They're not doing anything for leisure because of fear, because they haven't addressed problem behavior. And usually these are kids who are a little bit older, and it just shows you what the cumulative effect over time. This should have been addressed much, much earlier on because this is where we are, and it's likely to be a self-sustaining cycle to the end of their high school experiences. So in the past, historically, how have people looked at problem behavior? Well, there's these three common ways of looking at problem behavior. One is that it is inevitable if you have a label, right? I kind of joked yesterday, if you've got a child melting down in Safeway, a child with autism, and someone's giving you the dirty looks like in the video there, like, are you a bad parent? What's going on here? And you were just to say autism, they'd be like, oh, right? That explains it. That doesn't explain anything. Just because you have the label doesn't mean that you're going to problem behavior. But that's part of the danger with labels, is now that a lot of people expect, if you've got a label, I can expect problem behavior. But that doesn't really explain why the person's doing it or what they're getting from it. And as I said yesterday, there's lots of people on the autism spectrum who have zero problem behaviors. They are the best behaved kids in their families and their schools. So the label doesn't explain anything. It's not inevitable. Right? Just because you're a boy doesn't mean you have to do this. Just because you're a girl doesn't mean you have to do that. These are just useless summary labels that have become lazy excuses to justify patterns of behavior. Next, that it's within the person, that they're somehow just rotten to the core, deviant and bad. I worked with, one of my kids I've been with for 13 years. He has an elderly grandma who's from another country in the Middle East. And grandma she's really interested in what's happening with her kiddo, and she's got kind of broken English, but she always likes to chat with me about how her grandson is doing. He's doing fantastic in high school now, but in elementary school, we had walkie-talkies, 2 full-time staff, because he would take off and go into busy roads, and there's a lot of addressing his problem behavior. And one day I went to his home to work with one of his after-school BIs, and Grandma answers the door, and she's, oh, Richard, welcome, T. Can I talk to you? I'm sure, what would you like to talk about? And she's like, Johnny, how do I say? Johnny, even if no autism, Johnny just bad, yes? Johnny's just bad. And I had to stop myself from just laughing because that's so ridiculous. Like, why would you think he's bad? Because she can't go out in public with him. She's responsible for taking him to the grocery store, and she really struggles with it. And she's thinking that he's just bad. Like, there's just something in him that likes destruction and mayhem, right? No, he's not just bad. There's no such thing as someone who's just bad to the core, right? Unless maybe you're talking to a psychologist who might diagnose, antisocial personality disorder, something psychiatric, but that's not what we're talking about here. Maladaptive. I don't use the word maladaptive because by definition, none of us engage in maladaptive behaviors on a regular basis because maladaptive behaviors aren't good for us, maybe with the exception of smoking as a maladaptive behavior or maybe drinking alcohol to excess. But typically everything that we do every day is highly adaptive, right? We do things that work for us. We wouldn't do things that don't work for us. So problem behavior isn't maladaptive. It's not non-functional or meaningless. It's serving a function, right? WTF, what's the function? It is serving a function. Even if we don't have the sophistication to figure out in the moment what function is being served or functions, it's working somehow, right? It's not meaningless. It's not happening. We'll often hear, it just came out of the blue. There was no reason for it. The correct way to parse that would be, there was a reason for it, but I don't know what it is, right? I don't have the sophistication to know right now. So if this is the traditional goal, if this is a traditional consideration that it's because they have the label, it's meaningless, it's within the person, that kind of absolves me of any responsibility for dealing with it, right? How could I change this because it's nothing that I control? The person's just bad, or it's because they have autism. So I can't do anything about it. I bear no responsibility for the occurrence of this problem behavior, which means I don't have to do anything to my practice, to my teaching, to my parenting. I can just do business as usual. And then when problem behavior does occur, because it's not my responsibility, I can't control it, what's available to me is just to hammer it down with punishment procedures, right? So this is historically what has happened in schools and in our society and continues to happen in our society. We have a very punitive, aversive-based legal system and social justice system. What happens when you break the law of speeding? You get a punisher, you get a speeding ticket. What happens when you adhere to the speed limit? Nothing, you don't get a reinforcer for it. Unless you can argue that maybe you get points on your license for not crashing. So if you do something bad will happen to you. This has been the traditional response to problem behavior, right? You're being bad, you are bad, this bad thing will be the consequence. And that kind of is that traditional answer to the question I said earlier. What do I do when he does X, Y, and Z? And traditionally people would say, well, you should put him in timeout. Well, you should take away his privileges. Well, you should spank him. Well, you should yell at him. Right? That has been the traditional way of just waiting for it to happen and then responding in ways that suppress it. Right? So in schools, I've kind of focused here on traditional school reactive measures. There's scolding and reprimands. Does this continue to happen today? Absolutely. All parents scold and reprimand their kids. Teachers reprimand their kids all the time. It's appropriate. It's part of classroom management, right? If somebody's breaking a rule, doing something wrong, you can say, hey, don't do that. Here's why, okay? And if they stop doing it, then you just use a punishment procedure by definition, right? We're not using corporal punishment. That's where people's minds go when we talk about punishment. But for our purposes today, we're not talking about corporal punishment. So a scold or reprimand is completely appropriate. I had the experience once of going into an IEP meeting at a school, and I got there early, so I'm sitting in front of the office waiting. And as I walk into the school, I see a teacher bent over a student yelling at 2 kids for doing something wrong on the playground. As I'm waiting in front of the office, a kid comes in, he'd been sent in, gotten in trouble, he had to go see the principal. As I'm walking down to the classroom, I see a teacher talking to 2 girls for coming in early from recess and don't do that again. And then I got into the classroom and it happened to come up around punishment procedures, and we were talking about the child's challenging behavior, and someone mentioned about punishment. And one of the staff said, we don't do punishment in this school. And I thought, I didn't say anything, but I thought I saw 3 textbook examples of punishment as I walked into this meeting. Right? I saw 3 of your staff independently using punishment procedures. But it's not corporal punishment, so their minds aren't going there, right? And I'm not criticizing what those staff were doing. It was probably completely appropriate and defensible. My point is that it is ubiquitous, that it is normal. We do scold and reprimand, but technically that is punishment. Timeouts, right? Suspensions, expulsions. You don't get to go out for recess, you owe me 5 minutes. Those are types of timeouts. Sent to the office. So these top three commonly used punitive procedures in schools. The strap, not anymore, right? Used to be. I remember when I was a kid, vice principal had the strap like up on his office wall, and everyone would walk by and like look at it, and tell stories of who got that, right? We don't have the strap anymore. But they're inherently reactive, right? You're just kind of stuck in this loop of business as usual, and then I find myself reprimanding, scolding, etc. Right? That's the business as usual. All the focus is on what happens after problem behavior. There's no thought to preventing the problem behavior, right? If you think about where you're allocating your resources, it's like 99% of my thought goes to, what do I do when there's problem behavior? Maybe 1% goes to, how could I be avoiding this happening in the first place? Which, when people bring those problems to me, what do I do when? I'll typically kind of preface my answer by saying something to the effect of, you probably won't be very satisfied with my answer because I'm not actually interested in what you do after he engages in the problem behavior. I'm really, really interested in the many things that you can be doing proactively and preventatively so that you don't have problem behavior. I would rather that you had more peace of mind and quality of life because there simply were no problem behaviors than to be living on the edge and eggshells waiting for the problem behavior to occur and then focusing, what can I do after it happens, right? I put 99% of my focus on prevention, right? I want to be preventative and avoid it because then you're arguably having a much happier quality of life. The alternative is we're putting out fires. And how many of you, by show of hands, can think of in your schools a lot of firefighters, right? We're putting out a lot of fires. I think about some of my colleagues who operate at the district level. They get called in where there's fires. Their job is really to be a problem behavior firefighter, and they could just get drawn all over the place. It'd be better if we could kind of focus on preventative strategies so that we don't have as many fires to be putting out. So if we're using a lot of punishment, what are the problems with that? There are a lot of problems with punishment. Right? This is extremely well researched. We have a lot of research going back decades on the use of punitive procedures and some of the pitfalls of using them, so to speak. And note again, we're not talking about corporal punishment. So why do people, parents and teachers, continue to use these punitive strategies? Because it's very easy. Right? I don't have to do anything extra. I don't have to be thinking about anything until a problem occurs, and then I can just hammer it down with a punitive strategy, a reactive strategy. Right? So I can just wait. And as I said earlier, if you want something to happen, you have to reduce the response effort. Right? We're kind of averse to doing things that require more work for us. And if I just wait for problem behavior, that's arguably easier than having to put some thought and effort into preventing it in the first place. But I would argue that it's worth the investment. Punishment works. It works. That's why people use it, right? That's why you've all had the experience of reprimanding somebody or scolding and then they didn't do it again. And that's very reinforcing to us as the punisher, right? If your loved one, if your significant other does something and you yell at them and they don't do it again, that worked for you, right? And so we all have these really rich reinforcement histories where we've used punitive strategies, including with our students, and it's worked. And the beauty about punishment is there's really no lag time. When punishment works, it works instantly, which makes it so attractive to use, right? And it's ubiquitous. We've got reprimands, timeouts, loss of privileges, response cost, restitution, making it better, right? It's the first question I get, as I've said. What do I do when he engages in problem behavior? They want a punishment strategy because that's kind of how we've been indoctrinated and accultured in our society, right? People tend to experience bad things when they do bad things, but we don't focus on how do you prevent the bad things in the first place. So some of the potential negative effects of using positive punishment, where you're adding things like aversives, aggressive behavior. So 2 decades of studies have shown for children who received physical punishment an association with higher levels of aggression towards family members and towards peers. So if students are yelled at, we shouldn't be surprised if they do more yelling at other people, including easier targets, softer targets, like their younger siblings or younger students. Right? So we see as a byproduct of experiencing a punisher, then acting aggressively. And it can sometimes be aggressive towards the punisher. I had an instance once where I was working with a young lady who was a behavior interventionist, and there was a very large young high school man, and he was doing something, and she went up and she tried to tell him not to do it. She's giving him this light reprimand, and this wasn't programmed in any way. She was just making this decision on the fly, and he hauled back and punched her in the face and then grabbed both hands of hair and pulled, right? If you've ever had your hair pulled, it's excruciating, which is why I keep mine strategically short. Right? So she was delivering and she wasn't thinking that I'm being punitive, but she was delivering an aversive consequence, and he aggressed back at her, which when you think of it from his perspective, that's pretty clever because she's probably not going to do that again, right? That worked for him. Now you've got two problems. Whatever she was reprimanding him for, and the fact that he's learned that this aggression is really effective for me. Emotional behavior. Punishment may be associated with emotional side effects, including crying and fearfulness in general. So if you have a student who's constantly experiencing punitive consequences, that might make them anxious, they might be on edge, they might be anticipating the next time they get in trouble, and therefore they're not concentrating on their learning, right? They're not focusing on what they should be focusing on in their school setting because they're anxious and fearful of the next time someone might be punitive towards them. Escape and avoidance. The use of punishment may cause the associated people or situations to become punishers. So if I'm constantly giving someone timeouts or taking away their tokens or yelling at them for doing bad things, I am the agent of punishment. And guess what my rapport is going to be like with the student? Right? They're not going to like me. Why would they like me? I'm just associated with all these bad things. And what happens is then I become a warning stimulus. When I show up, I become a warning stimulus that life is probably going to start to get sucky, right? Because he's here and he does these things to me. So I don't want to be around him. So what I'm going to do is run away, right? It could also lead to aggression because then maybe he'll leave, right? So if you see kids running away and trying to flee the punisher, you really have a problem. You can kind of summarize this in terms of rapport. By being the agent of punishment, you've really killed your rapport. And we don't want to spend time with people we don't have a good rapport with. So consider punishment for mistakes in math. The math classroom. So if the student is doing poorly in math, and they're being criticized for it, they're experiencing some type of punishing consequence, then the math teacher, being in the math classroom, looking at the math materials, are all going to be very aversive to that child. And guess what? They're going to want to avoid math. They're going to be, I have a tummy ache, I need to go to the bathroom, I'm going to play hooky, I'm not going to go to math. Right? And it interferes with the ability of acquiring that skill as a byproduct of experiencing aversive consequences, punishment. That kind of makes sense, right? Modeling, kids copy. Kids are imitators. Kids copy adults. And in particular, kids copy influential adults in positions of power, which can be teachers and parents, et cetera. So if parents are using punishment strategies, we shouldn't be surprised if we start to see the kids modeling that. And just think in typical development. If you've got, a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old in a family, and the 4-year-old is being yelled at a lot, would you be surprised then if you see the 4-year-old going over to the 2-year-old and starting to treat the little brother the same way? Right? Because that's what mommy or daddy do, or that's what my preschool teacher does, and so I'm going to copy that because I'm learning by imitating people. If adults punish students, then students may be more likely to apply aversives to others in the future. There was a study going back decades that looked at if you teach kids a game where they can use aversive punishment, essentially they can fine somebody in the game as part of the rules, or they can play the game without any aversives like fines. The kids who learned it with fines were far more likely to add those types of punitive rules when they taught the game to others, versus kids who learned to play without the punitive consequences. When they taught others how to play, they didn't include punitive consequences, right? That's an example from one study. So it's another reason why we don't want to be using aversive. Kids will copy. Overuse of punishment. Because it's quick and easy and always accessible, and very attractive, then we can become reliant on it, right? It's just the easy thing to do. And if my go-to is punishment, then I'm going to be less likely to ever consider using preventative and reinforcing-based strategies because I've got this really effective thing that's available to me. And if I stick with it, it's probably just going to become an increasing cycle where I increasingly use punishment because it's so effective for me, and I might start to use increasing dosages of punishment, right? If my yelling at you is no longer working, then maybe I need to yell louder. Maybe I need to yell longer. Maybe I need to say more insulting things in order to have the same effect, right? So there's a bit of a slippery slope. Once you start using punishment, if a student habituates to it and it's no longer effective, then you're just going to try and find the next thing that you can use. And that means it's going to be increasingly aversive. And it's, these are the stories that wind up in the newspaper where there's a child with autism who's now, locked in the janitor closet under the stairs. Probably didn't start there. They probably started with other consequences and then had to escalate, and then they found themselves in this place that has become a human rights issue. a moral and ethical issue or a legal issue, right? They didn't start there. They probably graduated to that because punishment is a slippery slope, which is one of the reasons we want to avoid it in the first place. What's the future of this tactic? If a student's problem behavior is controlled by an aversive contingency in high school, meaning they've got a full-time SEA and they're pretty good because they've got someone monitoring the rules who's going to take away privileges the moment that they break those rules. This is working like gangbusters. It's beautiful in high school. But what's the future of this contingency? You're going to graduate from high school eventually, and then this person won't be here. So what's the survivability of this strategy, right? What's the future of this? How is this going to work in adult life, in employment, at home? If you're relying on aversive control, you really need to be thinking about the future and how do you reduce and eliminate your reliance on aversive control and focus on positive reinforcement. You can also get this interesting phenomenon called behavioral contrast, which means if I have Johnny in my math class and Johnny is acting inappropriately and I just hammer him with punishment, I yell at him, I embarrass him, I make him cry, and I make him come after school, he might stop misbehaving in my class, in which case, as the punisher, I've been reinforced for engaging in this behavior. It seems to be working for me, right? He's settled down in my class. But then what might happen is after math is over, Johnny goes over to music class, and then he's a nightmare in music class. Right? This is called a contrast effect. Just because punishment suppresses behavior in one setting, when it moves to another setting where the punishing agents are no longer present, then the problem behavior can get even worse because now all bets are off, right? And we sometimes see this as behavioral contrast. One of the things we say about punishment is that it is person and place specific, right? It's under what we call environmental control. So in math class, it's about this room with this teacher. It works here. But if other places and people aren't doing it, then it won't, then the problem behavior, all bets are off in those other places, right? So I can say, well, he's not a problem in my class, right? That's because I'm using punishment and the effects are person and place specific. Where in the other class, they're not using punishment. And so he hasn't experienced those consequences. No new behavior. What is the defining characteristic of a student with ASD? They lack the behaviors that many of their neurotypical peers have. Yesterday when we looked at the behavioral view of autism, it's all those areas of deficits. That's why they're in school. That's why they receive intervention, is to receive instruction and teaching to address those areas of deficit and improve the skills. If you're focusing on punishment, all you're showing them, you're sending messages about don't do that, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that, and don't do that. But what's missing is what you should be doing and why you should be doing it, and the positive reinforcing consequences for doing pro-social behaviors. So in terms of an educative response, it's a very limited educative response. Punishment just says, don't do that, but I haven't given you an alternative. And that's why it's also important, back to WTF. If I know what the function is, I understand that you're trying to achieve something. And if I could teach you a better, more appropriate pro-social way of achieving what you're after, then you wouldn't need to engage in the problem behavior. So a big part of the response to problem behavior should be identifying what does he need to learn to replace the problem behavior, and not just sending no, don't do that, because that's a really incomplete message. So the biggest problem. Punishment may work in the short term, but the effects are typically not permanent, right? Unless you keep that punisher alive, the problem behavior will tend to rebound. The effects of punishment are often person or place specific, as I've said, and perhaps most importantly, punishment does not teach you what to do, it just sends the message what not to do. Does that all make sense? Are you convinced there's problems with punishment? All textbook stuff.